Welcome to the Door Roller Money Podcast. I'm your host, Rob Berger. Today in episode 300, we're going to answer your questions. I can't believe it's episode 300, big round number. I guess not really more significant than 299 or 301, but somehow it feels like it is. And so what we did in the Facebook group, we asked for questions. And we got a ton of responses, and I'm gonna do my best to answer as many of them as I can. And if you're not a member of the Facebook group, doorroller.net/Facebook group, we'd love to have you. There's, 5,500 folks in the group now, and it's just designed to help folks make the most of their money. And it's a very helpful group. Folks, you ask a question, you'll get a half a dozen or more, helpful comments. People share resources, so it's been a great group. It's funny, I started it just because I couldn't handle all the email, and I had no idea where it was going to go. And, we're approaching 6,000 members, so it's worked out well. So doorroller.net/Facebook group. So we asked the question, we asked for questions in the Facebook group. And as I said, got a lot of great responses. Going to try to answer most of them. If I miss any, which I couldn't get to them all, I know, hopefully I'll tackle some others in future podcasts. By the way, before we go into the questions, before we go into the Q&A, in episode 299, the last episode, I videotaped the episode as well as just recording the audio. And we put it up on YouTube, and it's gotten a fair number of reviews, or not reviews, of views. And so if you want to watch me in the podcast, by the way, I'm not sure why you would, but if you do, you can go to YouTube and search for the Door Roller Money Podcast. We actually had put up a lot of old ones, but it was just the audio. So starting with episode 299, we got video, and I'm recording a video now. I'm looking at my little iPhone 10 staring back at me. And you can actually see in the video my beer can collection behind me. At least I used to have hundreds. And I decided I was a grown-up, although grown-ups can still have beer can collections. Anyway, it was sort of clutter. So I got rid of all of them except for the ones that actually, believe it or not, had some, sentimental value. I know it's hard to imagine, but one of them, and I'm pulling it off the shelf. See, you only get this if you watch the YouTube video. Cloud 9, my grandmother bought me this can. It's green, kind of a pretty shade of green. Cloud 9, she bought that for me. Well, she died in 95, so she would have bought this for me in probably 1980. And I have some that my father brought back to me when he would travel. So anyway, you get to see my beer can collection behind me, which, it's not every day you get to see that. In any event, the video, it's on YouTube if you want to watch it there. And of course, obviously, iTunes and everything else in terms of audio. But it also means like I can't pick my nose. I got to behave myself. I hope I don't pick my nose forgetting that I'm on camera. I don't know. But I'll try to do my best not to do that, although I'm scratching my ear right now. It's not quite as bad. Anyway, enough of that. You can check out the YouTube video if you want to. Let's turn to the questions. And I'm going to actually, for the first one, I'm going to group 3 different comments because they're all kind of related. The first one comes from David. He says, talk about indexed universal life insurance, please. All right. The next one wasn't so much a question as a comment. It comes from Jason. Several of my friends have attended to a free meal retirement planning informational session. Nothing is ever sold during the presentation, but of course, complimentary, no obligation financial reviews are offered as a follow-up if the person so chooses. At these follow-up meetings, the victims are sold annuities that they don't understand while believing the stories told by the salespeople. Most of my friends are not maxing out 401k, 403b, IRA, or other retirement vehicles and really have no idea what they've signed up for. But the salespeople are very polished, persuasive, and nice. And then third, from Daniel, would love an update on your vision plan with Mark Zoril, Z-O-R-I-L. All right, so believe it or not, these are all kind of related. So let's first talk about index universal life insurance. Let me first say I am not a life insurance expert. The only life insurance I've ever purchased is term life insurance. But that doesn't mean I don't have an opinion. And I'll give it to you, and you can do with it what you want. So when we think about life insurance, there's really sort of 2 buckets, right? There's term and permanent. Term life insurance, as the name suggests, it lasts for a term. Right? It could be 5 years, 10 years. I currently have a 20-year term life insurance. Normally, although you can't assume this, but normally the premiums each year stay fixed during the term. And you have life insurance. If you die during the term, it pays your beneficiaries. And if the 20 years in my case goes by and I don't die, nothing happens. It ends, and I'm done with the policy. Then there's permanent life insurance. And as the name suggests, it's permanent. It's designed to stay in force for your entire life. Now, let's think about that just for a second. And we all are pretty confident that someday we're going to die. We might not know when, but someday that big truck is going to be rolling down the alleyway at us, and it's going to take us out. So when you think about permanent life insurance from an insurance company's perspective, they know that eventually they're going to have to pay out a death benefit, assuming you don't cancel the policy, because it's permanent life insurance. And so for that reason, among others, permanent life insurance is much more expensive than term, right? It's very costly, and it's very complicated because it's not just usually the life insurance piece of it, but there's also an investment piece, or cash value, a term you've probably heard. And that kind of brings us now to indexed universal life insurance. It is a form of permanent life insurance. So before we get into indexed universal life insurance, let me just say this. The vast majority of people do not need permanent life insurance. You don't need it. You could line up 100 people randomly, and I'd be surprised if one or two of them had even the possibility of needing permanent life insurance. One example comes to mind, and that is if you have a disabled child and you're caring for them and they're going to still need care after you're gone. That would be one example, and we have a number of friends that are in that situation. But of course, that's a minority of folks, right? And there could be some other reasons, maybe complex estate planning, particularly if your estate is so large that you could be paying estate taxes. Of course, that's always in flux, exactly what those are going to be. But again, that's not going to apply to the vast majority of people. So to me, most people, you don't even give it a second thought. You don't care what indexed universal life insurance is. You don't have any need for permanent life insurance. You're going to stick with term. That's the vast majority of people. So indexed universal life insurance. So the idea here is, remember we talked about with permanent life insurance, you can have the part of your premium goes to pay for the actual insurance, right? And part of it goes into, we'll call it an investment account. You hear it talked about cash value. And the question becomes, what happens to that pot of money? Does it earn interest? If so, how much? How is that interest determined? Can the value ever go down? How do you get access to it if you want it? Right? These are all important questions. In the case of indexed or equity indexed universal life insurance, the amount that you can accumulate in that, we'll call it cash value fund, it's not really a term, but I'll use it, is determined at least in part in an index, an equity index. Doesn't have to be, could be the S&P 500. Now, here's the idea, and by the way, there are equity indexed annuities too that don't have a life insurance component. But the idea behind it is, look, oftentimes these sorts of policies are sold based on fear, right? And the fear is stock market crash, right? Everyone remembers 08 and 09. So they use that as a way to talk people into these policies. And what they'll tell you is you can't lose money on these policies. If you're the money that goes into, we'll call it the, equity indexed portion of this policy, it may even say 0% is the lowest you'll do. If the market loses 30%, you don't lose 30%, right? 0% is the worst you can do in a given year. And that's very comforting to a lot of folks. But there's always a cost, right? There's always a cost to certainty, right? You think about life insurance in general gives us some form of financial certainty, but at a cost, right? Car insurance gives us some form of certainty. If we hit someone and hurt them, it won't bankrupt us, usually, and depending on your limits, right? We can rely on insurance. So certainty always costs us money, and it's just as true in an indexed annuity or indexed universal life insurance policy as anything else. And so what are those costs? Well, it's going to depend on the specific terms of the policy. And they vary, and they're immensely complex. But what I've seen are a couple things. One is they'll cap your upside. So if it's tracking the S&P 500 index, they may say, we're going to cap it at 4% or 8% or 10% or 14%, but we're going to cap it. Meaning, if we have another 2013 where the market is up 32%, you're not going to actually get 32%. That'll exceed the cap. Let's say the cap is 10%. You'll get 10%. We'll keep the other 22%. That's sort of the cost of the security, right? Another way they can cap it, if you will, is through a participation rate. They'll say, well, you'll get the upside, but only 60% of the upside or 80% of the upside. We'll keep the difference, right? The other problem are fees. And I was looking at one policy sold by a very well-known company. And in the first year, they charged you a fee of 10% of your premium. So if you paid $5,000 a year for your first premium, they'd keep $500 right off the top before they use the rest to pay for your actual life insurance premium or put any into your cash value. 10% right off the top. And after that, it was 6% every single year. And those numbers weren't guaranteed. The fees could actually go as high as 15% a year. So at a high level, I've kind of outlined the biggest problems with indexed universal life insurance. One, immensely complicated. Two, it gives you some sense of security, but at a very significant cost. We should not understate the loss of a capped or participation rate. I mean, even if it's capped at 10 or 14%, that seems great. But remember, when we look at the historical stock market and we say the S&P 500 has returned 10% a year since going back to whenever, 1926, let's say, that's because in part there were many years where we made 20 and 25 and 30%. You take those out and you don't get 10%. Sort of average annual return. So that cap is significant. And then the other one is fees. Fees are significant on almost all of these policies. So my personal view for me is I don't even consider permanent life insurance, let alone indexed universal life insurance or an indexed annuity. That being said, if you're seriously considering it, or maybe because of your family situation, you think you need permanent insurance, I highly recommend that you talk to someone other than the person selling you the policy. Talk to someone knowledgeable who can give you some unbiased advice. By the way, if someone tells you, they're a fee-only planner or some other way, they're trying to convince you that they're unbiased, but they're the ones selling you the policy. They may be wonderful and they may have your best interest at heart. I would still get advice from someone knowledgeable who is not selling you something or not selling you the policy or the annuity. And that brings me to Mark Zorel. So I've had Mark on the podcast before. You can just go to doughroller.net and search for it if you've not listened to it. But Mark is a certified financial planner who, for $96 a year, which seems impossible, right? Impossibly low, will give you a financial plan. Whether it's, he'll talk about insurance that you need. He'll talk about retirement, Social Security, pensions, asset allocation, investing, 401k, Roth versus traditional. And I actually had a second call with him, a couple of months ago. And, he was terrific as always. I mean, we kind of came to the conclusion that going forward, I'm probably fine. I don't need a lot of hand-holding given my background in this and my financial situation. But he was terrific, and I highly recommend him. And to be clear, I have no financial incentive whatsoever to recommend Mark. He's never paid me a dime. By the way, if I were to ever mention something where I did have a financial incentive, I would tell you that. I rarely talk about affiliate products on the show. Every now and again I do, but I would disclose that. But in any event, Mark, no financial incentive at all. I think he's terrific. You may have someone else. That's great too. But the key is someone who doesn't have a financial interest in selling you the policy or the annuity because, again, they may have your best interest at heart. They may be very knowledgeable, but they still have that financial interest. And I think it's such an important decision that it's worth taking the time to talk to someone else. All right. So I hope that's helpful. By the way, I guess one other thing, and I'll hold this up for the folks watching on YouTube. This is a book. It's called Buying Annuity. So it's not life insurance really, although they're often kind of related. It's by Steve Weissman. It's The Truth About Buying Annuities. I kind of use it as a reference. I've never actually read it cover to cover. It's sort of designed, I think you could read it cover to cover. It's very easy to read, very easy to understand. If you're interested in annuities, I don't even remember when I got this book. I've had it forever. I don't even know when it was published. But it's a pretty good book on annuities, 2009. So if you want to learn more. All right, what do we got next? Let's see, this comes from Aaron. I'm hearing more and more commercials urging individuals to continually purchase a new home every X number of years and then rent the old property. All right. My question is twofold. One, what has your experience been with rental properties? And two, do these programs give you 2008 financial crisis deja vu? I'm going to actually couple that with another question that I think, I'm looking at my notes here, and I can't find it, but I remember the question, and it was, should you ever use your home equity line of credit to buy real estate? And, oh yeah, here we go. This is from Richard. I know you've mentioned owning rental property as part of your overall investment strategy. Would it ever be okay to purchase a rental property using a home equity line of credit, or should I save to pay cash for a property outright? So I'll kind of maybe cover those both at the same time. So a little bit of background. I with a good friend of mine, we bought 2 rental properties in 2005. And then from then to 2008, we added 3 more. These were all single-family homes in Central Ohio, where we both grew up. He still lives there. And they were all HUD foreclosures. And it was at a time, of course, when you think about the housing crisis, we bought our 5th one in 2008. So the housing crisis certainly was underway then. It got worse, I think. 2009 and 2010 were pretty rough. And they have been absolutely fantastic investments. We've actually sold 2 of them since then, one to the tenant and one to a real estate investor who wanted a property. We have 3 more. We're actually, for the first time, so we've been at this now, let's see, 2005 to 2018, 13 years. We are now, for the very first time, evicting someone. Now, I doubt we'll actually have to evict them. They'll probably move out. But we've had pretty good luck with our tenants. And when we evict the one tenant, we're going to sell that house. So we'll be down to 2. And it's possible that my friend could buy me out of the other 2. Sort of one of the inequities, if you will, is that he has to do all the work because he's local. And so we've kind of known for a while that he'd probably eventually buy me out, because that just doesn't make sense long term, although we have been at this 13 years. And we bought them all with virtually no money down, which we could do. What we did was we found a local bank that's what they call a portfolio lender, meaning they don't sell the mortgage into like Freddie or Fannie. They keep it on their balance sheet. They have a portfolio of loans, thus portfolio lender. And they don't have to, as a result, they don't have to follow the strict rules that Freddie and Fannie require. And so what they would do is they would lend us 100% of the appraised, or the appraised value of the home after we improved it, because all of them required some amount of work. And we got them at such a discount through HUD that even when you add in the cost to rehab it, we almost always finance, if not 100% of it, awfully close. Now, let me just say to start with that while we did it that way, we both had the financial resources to handle long-term non-payment of rent. And we have 3 homes now with 3 mortgages, but we could go in together and pay off all the mortgages tomorrow if we wanted to. So on the one hand, it sounds like we were highly leveraged, but really, when you looked at all of our finances, not really. Which kind of goes to Richard's question about a home equity line of credit. I wouldn't rule that option out of hand. You just have to kind of be aware of the downsides, right? If something were to go wrong and you defaulted on that home equity line of credit, you could lose your home, right? And it's pretty significant. So one of the things I look at is, am I buying a home? What's the value of the home that I'm buying relative to the rental market? In Columbus and Central Ohio, we could generally get rents equal to 1% of our investment. So if we put $100,000 total into a property, we would get roughly $1,000 a month in rent. That's not the case everywhere. It's certainly not the case in Northern Virginia. And we were dealing with relatively inexpensive homes, again, relative to, say, Northern Virginia. Our last home was a 3-bedroom in a good school district. I think we paid $40-some thousand for it from HUD, and we put in some money. I think our total investment was $64,000. We sold it a handful of years later for $105,000, I think, and that was after getting really good rents during that entire time. So it turned out to be a great investment. But if you're going to try to invest in some place where real estate is extremely high, and therefore you're going to have a big mortgage, and you couldn't financially withstand a tenant who didn't pay for a couple of months, I would never put myself in that position. In my view, at a minimum, you want to be able to handle a year's worth of non-payment. Now, we've never experienced that. I'm just risk averse. And frankly, when we bought the two that we did in '05 to get started, I was scared to death. This goes back before I started Dough Roller. I mean, and I was, I kind of chuckle when I think back on it, but I was terrified. Anyway, the investments, though, long story short, have done very well. We've had very good luck with tenants. We've had the typical stuff you have to do: replace a roof, replace a furnace. Now we've got an eviction. So these things happen. That's part of being a landlord. The interesting question, I think, from Aaron is, do these programs give you 2008 financial crisis deja vu? We didn't skip a beat in 2008 because we weren't selling, right? Yeah, the values went way down, but our tenants kept paying. People still needed places to live. And so we didn't really think about it. It's no different than my own home. The value of my wife and I's house, went way down, 08, 9, 10. But we weren't selling, so who cares, right? Well, maybe you care, but you don't really care. And it was the same with our rental properties. We weren't selling, so really didn't give it much thought. There was no issue at all. And by the way, it was a great time to buy. The truth of the matter is we should have bought a lot more back then, but for various reasons, we just didn't. So, I don't know about the idea of X number of, stay in a home X number of years and then move, but generally speaking, I think it can be a great way to build wealth. I know folks that have bought a duplex, lived in one half, rented out the other, and when they could, they moved and kept it and rented out the other half that they were living in. It's a job. It's not just a passive investment. It's a job. So, you need to keep that in mind, which is something I remind folks when they try to compare, say, investing in the stock market versus being a landlord. Well, they're two different things. I mean, being a landlord, unless you're going to hire someone to do all the work for you, but even then, liability issues, and yes, there are ways to deal with liability issues, but it's just comparing it to the stock market, to me, doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Is it a great way to build wealth? I think it is, but it's just different and it's a lot of work, so you just got to keep that in mind. All right, next one comes from Scott. I would like to hear Rob's current thoughts regarding bucket portfolios and retirement, pros and cons, etc. Love the podcast. Really appreciate topics being discussed at a high level. Well, great question. And I was actually looking at bucket portfolios this week. So first of all, what's a bucket? What's Chris or Scott even talking about? So when you think about asset allocation, when you're sort of in your working years and you're saving, you think of it in percentages, right? So you think, well, I'll put whatever, 80% in equities and stocks and 20% in bonds, for example, or 70-30 or whatever. The bucket strategy is designed for those nearing retirement or in retirement. And the idea is this: let's stop thinking in percentages. Let's instead think in buckets, with the first bucket representing money you'll need over, let's say, the next year or two to live on if you're in retirement. So let's say you spend 50 grand a year and you want 2 years of cash. Your first bucket would be the cash bucket, and you'd have 100 grand in there. It covers your expenses for the next 2 years. And then your second bucket you think of it as sort of your intermediate term bucket, and it's going to be high grade bonds, mainly government bonds. Could be high grade, investment grade corporate bonds, but it's going to be bonds. And just like an asset allocation using percentages, there's no one way to do this, but let's just say your bond bucket might be 7 years worth of expenses. So in this case, $350,000. And then everything else that you have would go into stocks, right? So that's the idea behind a bucket portfolio. And I like it. I mean, I'm not there yet, but I suspect I will use it when I do get there. And I want to give you a resource, and I'm looking it up now. And it's Christine Benz, B-E-N-Z. She works at Morningstar, and I kind of view her as sort of the expert on the bucket portfolio strategy. And I'm looking at one of her articles. I actually tweeted this article earlier this week. I thought it was really good, and it was how pre-retirees can transition to a bucket strategy. So you can Google that if you want. But she's, I think, the excellent resource, and she's written a lot about it. So my thinking on it, here's where I think the tricky part comes in with a bucket portfolio. Imagine you've got 2 years of cash, we'll call it 8 years of bonds, and the rest in stocks. And we'll just use 50,000 as an example. So you've got 100 grand in a cash account, or short-term bonds, could be, I suppose, government bonds. And so the first year goes by, and you've spent 50 grand, right? So what do you have? Well, you have 50 grand in your cash account. Now, what you have in your bond bucket and your stock bucket depends on how the markets have performed. Bond rates are pretty low, so you're probably still going to have roughly 8 years of expenses in the bond bucket, probably, particularly if you adjust for inflation. And in the stock bucket, well, it just depends on what the market did, right? But here's the question. You're going to replenish your cash bucket, right? You're down to 1 year, and if your goal is to keep 2 years, you need another 50 grand, right? Well, where do you take that from? Well, I guess if you have your 8 years in the bond bucket, you'd probably take it from the stocks, right? Well, that's going to raise questions. I mean, there's going to be tax considerations, right? And it depends what kind of accounts you have for your stocks. It could be Roth, and there's no tax consequences, but it could be tax-deferred traditional retirement accounts where you would get taxed, or it could be from a taxable account where you might have some capital gains. Just depends, right? So you've got that question. The other question you have is, where's the market now? Is it overvalued, undervalued? Notice I didn't say, is the market going to go up in the next year or down? Because we don't know that. But we can certainly look at some measures like price to earnings and at least get on a historical basis, is the market under or overvalued? But keep in mind, if we'd done this, after 2013, we would have probably all said it was overvalued. But look what it's done since then. It's gone up, right? That's the tricky part. When you're going to replenish your cash, where do you take it from? And I don't think there's a hard and fast rule to that. I think the way I will do it is, again, looking at a high level, do I think the market is fairly valued, overvalued, or undervalued? So right now, if it were today, I would take it from the stock bucket, assuming I've still got roughly 8 years or whatever I decide I want in my bond bucket. I would probably take it from the stock bucket. Now, that doesn't mean stocks aren't going to go up, right? I could take it from the stock bucket and stocks could go up 10% over the next 12 months, right? There's no way I can make that decision based on the future of the market. I just can't predict it. Some people think they can. If you think you can, have at it. I don't think you can, by the way, and I know I can't. So you say, well, I get that, Rob, but boy, there's some judgment in there and we all get uncomfortable when we're making these judgment calls. Yeah, we do. I don't know what to tell you. It's a judgment call. But that's probably what I would do. Now, the tough part is when you hit another 08, 09 and your stocks are down 50%, I would take from the bond fund. But that's going to be really hard to do. You've just watched your stocks get cut in half, right? You want to stop the bleeding. Your spouse says, what are you doing? You're not listening to that stupid podcast again, are you? Right? Yeah. So, but we're not at that moment right now. It's easier to think about these things, with a clear head and a cup of coffee, which I've got now. So if we're down 50%, I hope I would take from the bond bucket because that would be the smart thing to do. All right. Christine Benz, Morningstar, excellent resource. All right, next question comes from Greg. Mathematically, I know it doesn't make sense to cash out non-retirement investments in the market to pay off your home if your returns are a higher percentage rate than your interest rate on your mortgage. But at what point is the diminished risk and alleviated debt a consideration that trumps the math? Is it just based on personal risk threshold and comfort, or is there a quantifiable percentage or value or variables that makes cashing out non-retirement mutual funds to pay off your mortgage a viable decision in your mind? The prospect of being entirely debt-free is appealing, but the loss of a high volume of readily available assets, in his case about $195,000, at least causes enough pause to ask the question. In this instance, I would not be touching my 401k, my Roth, or my emergency fund, or my short holding ESPP stock, employee stock purchase plan stock. And income is about $185,000 gross. He's 47 years old. Plan would be to keep maxing out the 401k and the Roth and the ESPP and to replenish non-retirement investment portfolio once mortgage is paid off. Well, Craig, this is a great question, and it's kind of the thing I dealt with for years until I ultimately paid off my mortgage in 2016. And so here's the answer. It's really not an answer. Here's my thoughts on this. First of all, and I'll use my situation as an example. I paid off, prior to 2016, I would pay off chunks. So this is not all or nothing, right? The answer doesn't have to be cash in everything to pay off the mortgage entirely. You could pay it off in chunks. And that's what I did for a long time, 20,000 here, 50,000 there. For kind of the same reasons that you've sort of described. I mean, I know long-term I'm going to do better in the stock market, but short-term, I don't know. And there's just something nice about not having any debt. And then when 2016 rolled around, I put like $350,000 to pay off the mortgage. And now, had I not done that, had I kept it in an S&P 500 index fund, would I be better off today in the middle of 2018? Yeah, I'd be richer. I'd have more wealth, right? Because the market's done pretty well. Do I regret paying it off? No, not at all. My situation, and in some ways it sounds similar to yours, Craig, and that is you're going to be okay whatever you do. I mean, given the numbers you've given us here, you're going to be fine, right? This really isn't, I mean, one way to look at this is how can I absolutely maximize my net worth? That's the only thing I care about. And if that's the case long term, you're probably better off keeping the mortgage long term, right? Even if the market crashes 50% tomorrow, long term, you're probably better off. I guess part of that could depend on how quickly you could replenish the money you've used to pay off the mortgage, but we can't predict the market, right? But I don't think that's the only answer. Part of it is, are you meeting your financial goals? And if you are, my sense is, well, at least for me, I'll speak for myself, I realized that I was going to meet my financial goals, whatever I chose. And I sort of paid down the debt here and there over time. And I just felt like, okay, we're going to pay it off. And part of my thinking was the market's richly valued. This was in 2016. By the way, my thought wasn't, I think the market's going to go down in the next 12 months, because I just don't make decisions based on my view of the market in the future. But I did think it was overvalued, or certainly by historical norm, I think it was. I think it probably still is. Although on an interest rate basis, given how low rates are, one could argue it's not overvalued. In any event, that was my decision. And I suppose some could say, in hindsight, it was a bad decision, but I don't regret it. I'm not sure I don't know how helpful that answer is, but it's the answer I've got for you. Again, the only thing I would really say to think about is it's not all or nothing. You could do it in chunks, but I think you're going to be okay no matter what you decide, at least from what you've shared with us. All right, Tony, he asks, long-term business viability of M1 Finance. M1 Finance is one of the Robo advisors. It's somewhat unique. You can put together a portfolio of individual stocks and buy them, and most of their services are now free. So the short answer to Tony's question is I have no idea what the long-term business viability of M1 Finance is, but I can speak to the long-term business viability of robo-advisors in general. And I think, so they've certainly grown in assets under management, right, significantly. You've certainly got billion-dollar robo-advisors. But they still, to the extent they disclose this information, they're probably not very profitable, most of them. They're charging a pretty low rate. M1 Finance, in many cases, it's zero. But Betterment, let's say 25 basis points. It takes a lot of assets under management to cover their expenses. And so my view is that long term we'll have to see some acquisitions and consolidation in the space. I think that's the only way that's just how it's going to play out. Now, what that will look like, I have no idea. I think when we'll find out, I believe, is in the next recession, right? I mean, Betterment was, I think, a 2010 company when it started. And I met John Stein, like as soon as he launched it. He was at a conference I was at. I think it was 2010. But they haven't really had a bad market, right? They've had a very good market. And index passive investing is sort of at a high water mark right now. People love it, but that's going to change, right? You just wait for the next bear market, and when actively managed funds, on average, start to do a little bit better than passive investing, you'll get all the articles about how bad passive index fund investing is, and I think that's when we'll see who the survivors are. But how will M1 Finance or any other specific robo-advisor fare during that time? I don't know. By the way, your investments should be fine, right? If they fail, right, because the custody of your actual investments are going to be with someone else, whoever they use to custody their assets. So unless there's some awful shenanigans going on, you shouldn't actually lose your investments themselves. All right, this one comes from Bob. So far, it's almost all men. Where are the women? Anyway. Do I have any questions from women? I think I have one. All right. Anyway, Bob. He says, how to determine what tax rate to go up to in converting deferred to... I'm going to try that again. I'm going to read it just as he's written it, and then I'll interpret it for you. How to determine what tax rate to go up to in converting deferred to Roth between FI and RMDs. So deferred, he means deferred retirement accounts, tax-deferred retirement accounts like your traditional 401k or IRA. Of course, Roth, he means Roth accounts. FI is financial independence, and RMD, required minimum distribution. So what in the world is Bob talking about? So the idea here is, let's say you've reached financial independence and you retire and you're 55. And as a result of retiring, your income is non-existent, right? You may have some investment income, but maybe you have a part-time job or a side hustle, but you're not making as much money as you used to. And you're 55, so you don't have to take any money out of your taxable retirement or your tax-deferred retirement accounts until you're what, 70 and a half. Can't forget the half, 70 and a half. So, why not convert some of that tax-deferred money into Roth accounts? Yes, you'll pay taxes, but since you don't have a job or a full-time job, or you're not making the income you once made, your tax rates are much lower, right? Of course, the more you convert, then the more taxable income you have. Eventually, you could convert so much that you're back up to the tax rate you had, when you were working. And I think his question is, well, so how high up should I go? My first response to this is talk to a tax accountant. Mark Zorro actually would be another good option. But I have two sort of substantive thoughts to consider if you're evaluating this. The first is, how much time do you have between now and when you're 70 and a half, between now and your required minimum distribution? Because I would map out a long-term game plan. I mean, if I have 15 years, depending on how much I have in my tax-deferred accounts, what if I spread it out evenly over those years? Would that end up transferring all of it? Or maybe you're so well off it would transfer a very small amount. I don't know. But I don't want to bump myself up into a higher tax bracket than I need to. If I've got 15 years, and let's say I get crazy and do all the converting in the first 5 of it, and as a result I'm in a higher tax bracket than I needed to be if I'd spread the conversions out over 15 years, that doesn't make any sense, right? Now, of course, hopefully your retirement accounts are growing. So yeah, you could have a year where you convert 50,000 but what's left grows by 75,000, right? So it could feel like you're kind of 2 steps forward, 3 steps back. But that's sort of the first consideration. How much time do you have to do these conversions before the RMDs kick in? And the second thing is, and this is hard to figure out, and you have to make a lot of assumptions. Mark Zorro can help you. But when you do hit the RMD age, based on the best information you have now, what will your tax rate be, right? What will your RMDs be? And they have ways to project this. Again, there's assumptions being made. You got to make an assumption about what your growth is going to be between now and when you're 70 and a half. You got to make an assumption about the tax rates then. We don't know what those are going to be. But you can make those assumptions. Okay, given these assumptions, which seem reasonable, when I hit my RMD, I'm going to be in this tax bracket, right? Well, then that might suggest that you should convert up to, not quite to that tax bracket, but up to the one right below it, right? Now, is that guaranteed to get you the best result? No, again, we're making all kinds of assumptions, right? Again, part of that will depend on how long you have until you hit 70 and a half. If you're really young, you hit FI at 40, you're going to just have to make best guesses, right? Again, I think your tax accountant or someone like Mark Zorro could help you make those assumptions and guess. You just have to keep in mind it's not set in stone. Any event, Bob, that's how I would think through it. And by the way, I could very well have this same issue. Not this year, and I don't know about next year, but I'll be converting deferred to Roth as well, and I'll have to go through this exact same thing, and that's how I'm going to do it. All right, Jason. Since we can't undo Roth conversions anymore, what is the thought process to review doing conversions? Do we adopt a pseudo dollar cost averaging mindset with conversions, especially if a protracted downturn starts the day after a conversion is made or before just a really bad day? Well, it's a great question. The problem is I generally don't make investment decisions based on a prediction of what the market's going to do. I have no idea what it's going to do tomorrow, let alone next week, month, or year. So in my case, I just convert them. That's what I would do. However, if it makes you feel more comfortable to do it over, the course of a year, in multiple steps, that's fine. I don't think anything bad. I think it's a perfectly fine choice, right? It could cost you, right? What if the market goes up and you're converting and you end up paying more taxes, right? That's the problem. You don't know which way is going to be the best until you've done it. So. To me, the key is just to recognize we can't predict the market. I know we think we can, but we can't. I can't anyway. All right, Grayson, how do you know when you've reached your financial independence number, and what do you do after you've gotten there? Well, what you do, that's the easy part. You celebrate. Celebrate. Dance to the music. Does that show my age? Probably. My kids would shake their heads if they were listening, but they don't ever listen to this podcast. I think the more interesting question, well, that's not true. The less interesting question is how you know you got there. Actually, the more interesting question is, what do you do when you get there? In some ways, it's kind of like, what do you do when you retire? Some people have a hard time figuring that out. I don't have an answer for you. Pursue your passion, your purpose, whatever's meaningful to you. But how do you know when you get there? Well, the general rule of thumb is that when you've reached financial independence when your investments equal 25 times your annual expenses. So if you spend $100,000 a year, you'd need $2.5 million to reach financial independence. Now, it's not a rule. They call it the 4% rule. If you flip the math around, right, 4% times 2.5 million gets you 100 grand, right? But it's really not a rule. It's more of a guideline, right? Here's the idea behind it. So they did studies, this is going back in the early 90s, I think the early 90s, where they said, okay, you can take, in year one of financial independence, you can take 4% out of your investments. And then after that, each year you can, whatever that number is, let's assume you got $1 million, so that's 40 grand. Take out 40 grand in year one. Year two, you throw the 4% away. You're done. The 4%, it's funny, it's called the 4% rule, but the 4% actually only applies to year one. Starting in year two, completely forget 4%. What you do in year two is you take the 40,000 that you number that you withdrew in year one and simply adjust it for inflation. And that's what you take out in year two. And then you adjust that number in year three by inflation, and you keep going, right? And the idea is that if you have a reasonably sound asset allocation, let's call it 60-40, 60 equities, 40 bonds, you have a high likelihood of having enough money until you die. That's basically the theory behind the 4% rule, or in my case, 25x your annual expenses. Now, there are all kinds of caveats and issues to think about. The first is taxes. If you need, say, 40 grand a year on an after-tax basis, right, you need to adjust your everything by taxes. If we imagine all your money is in tax-deferred retirement accounts, and you got $1 million, you can't just take out 40 grand. You're going to have to pay taxes on it. So you're not going to have 40 grand after taxes. So you're going to have to make adjustments for taxes. Now, it could be that all your money is in a Roth and you don't get taxed at all. It could be that all your money is in a taxable account and you're going to get taxed on some of it, capital gains, and maybe not others. Or like many people, you may have little in all three different kinds of investments. So you got to factor in the taxes. The second thing is you got to think about your age. I mean, if you hit financial independence when you're 30, I would be less reliant on the 4% rule than if I were 60. At 30, I might want the 3% rule, which would require me to have more money. So age and taxes are really critical. But as a general rule, I think you reach financial independence when you've got 25 times your annual expenses, which means, by the way, the lower your expenses, the easier it is to hit financial independence, right? If you spend $25,000 a year like Mr. Money Mustache, it's far easier to reach financial independence than if you spend 100 grand a year. You need less money, right? So there you go. All right. This one comes from Brett. How many more we've got? I guess 3 more. All right, this one from Brett. Many financial independence calculations assume that you can extrapolate from your current annual expenses plus inflation for the rest of your life. What about all the things that might change in the future and add unexpected expenses? Are there any tips for estimating future expenses in a more principled manner than just assuming no change forever? Great question. Sure there are. I mean, the way I kind of walk it through in my own situation was to walk through my big expenses. So I thought, well, first of all, and this was a few years ago when I kind of went through this exercise, we were paying a mortgage. I know we're not going to have a mortgage when I hit financial independence or retire. So that's one big expense that's going to go down. Now, it's not going to go away. I mean, in the sense that I'm still going to have to pay real estate taxes, homeowner insurance, maintenance, so forth. But I'm not going to have the mortgage payment, the principal and interest. Another one is we weren't going to be paying for kids. At least I hope not, right? So they're going to be out on their own, and that's a big expense. I'm thinking, beyond college and all that sort of thing. On the other hand, some would say healthcare costs could go up, right, in retirement, particularly as you get older. And that's certainly true. And there's another thing to consider. What you spend at age 65 is probably going to be very different than what you spend should you live to be 95. At 65, you want to play golf every day, or you want to travel. You've got all these things you want to do. At 95, I don't know what I'm going to be doing at 95. Probably just hanging on if I make it that long. I'm not sure. Maybe I'll call for the truck at that point. But the point is that we think of retirement as sort of this one static thing, and it's not. Your life is going to be very, very different at 65, most likely, than it will be at even 75 or 85 or 95. So how you adjust for that is difficult, which for me means that I'm very conservative. I never want to sort of assume that I can get by on a bare bone budget, right? I want to factor in big expenses like not having the kids to pay for or a mortgage, but I also need to factor in the additional healthcare costs. And part of it's going to be what kind of life you want to lead once you are financially independent. It's funny, my wife and I talk about this. It's like, shouldn't we want to travel more? I mean, we could do that. We could literally pick up tomorrow and travel anywhere we wanted. The work that I do, I could do from anywhere. And we're home every day, when we travel, it's usually to see family. I mean, we are going to go somewhere. We're celebrating our 30th anniversary this year. And so we're going to go to New York City just for a weekend, but next year we're going to go probably to Europe. But we're just not big world travelers. We're kind of boring. I don't know. But maybe you want to travel the world, and so you need to factor that in. So I guess the point is, to me, it's no different than any other budget. You just need to walk through each item. First of all, what's it going to look like in retirement, or when you reach financial independence, right? I mean, maybe you can go down to one car because you're not driving to work every day. You're not paying for parking and gas and insurance. So in that sense, your costs go down. Generally, once you truly retire, overall your costs go down, particularly if you compare it to when you're 30 and 40 and 50. When you've got kids, you got a mortgage, you're paying for school education, you're commuting to work, you're doing all the work things. Yes, there's healthcare costs, but I think by and large for most people, my own view of this is your costs will actually go down. But again, I would be conservative on that. I wouldn't make any big, decisions assuming a bare bones budget. I hope that helps, Brett. Okay, let's see. Svetlana. Hi. Do you think about emerging market indexes as a 401k investment long term? Given current political and economical situation and rise of Asian countries, China in particular, should I switch from investments in European markets to emerging markets? Thank you, and bravo for 300th episode. Well, thank you. Great question. So again, my view of this is I don't ever sort of try to predict by and large. So I've always had 10% of my asset allocation in emerging markets, 10%. And I have usually about 20% in developed countries, which would include most of Europe kind of thing, right? And that doesn't change for me. It's interesting, emerging markets have been down, so I actually made a pretty significant investment in emerging markets as part of my asset allocation this year in an account, and I've lost money in that so far. I'll actually probably sell it to lock in some tax losses and either pick a different kind of fund that has emerging market exposure or just wait the 30 days for the 30 wash sale rule and then get back in. But I don't change my asset allocation. I mean, I think it's good to have emerging market exposure all the time. That's my view. Mine's 10%. That's, again, you could easily justify all kinds of different percentages. Well, not all, but it is volatile, very volatile. So you have to keep that in mind, but that's kind of what you want. That's the whole point of asset allocation, right? You want some things when some things do well, other things do bad. When they do well and other things do bad, it kind of levels the playing field. So anyway, 10% is what I put in there, and I think some emerging market exposure is good. By the way, there's different ways to get that exposure. I have the Vanguard Emerging Market Index Fund, but if you do the total international, I'm looking this up, stock index fund Vanguard, what's the ticker? It is VGTSX. I'm going to put that in Morningstar. VGTSX, Vanguard Total International Stock Index. This is investor shares. And if I go to portfolio, I think it will tell me somewhere the exposure. Yeah. So that fund, it has 82.6% in developed markets and 17.4% in emerging markets. Now, when I say mine's 10%, that's 10% of my total portfolio. But one way to get exposure to it is just to put, I could put just, instead of 10% in emerging markets and 20% in developed, I could just put 30% in the Vanguard Total International Stock Index Fund. It would change my allocation from where it is right now, but a perfectly legitimate way to do it. And so there you go. By the way, if you want to see the breakdown of other funds, if you put it in Morningstar, go to the portfolio tab for a given fund and then scroll to the bottom, or almost the bottom. You'll see world regions, and it will show you, what's the exposure to North America, Latin America, United Kingdom, Europe developed, Europe emerging, and so on. And then below that, they have just market classification. Percent that's in developed markets, percent that's in emerging markets. All right, the last question comes from Denise. So there were two women. Thank you. Anyway, this is the last question of the day. I know you're grateful. What would you do with or teach to your children about money when they were younger to better prepare them for life? That's a great question. And I look back on it, wish I'd have done so much better. I think the first thing I would have done was to start with an allowance much earlier than I did. And I would make them work for it. When they're younger, it may be, helping around in the kitchen or, helping somewhere in the house. As they get older, maybe in the yard. I wouldn't tie it to like things they should do anyway, like cleaning up their toys, right? Or keeping the room straight, right? They shouldn't get an allowance for that, in my view. But I would give them an allowance, and I would force them to save some of it, and I'd pay them interest. I would make them give some to charity, and then the rest they could spend. But here's the key. I wouldn't, once they spent it, that was it until the next allowance, right? There would be no mom and dad coming in and give them more money to buy something at the store, right? I would make them feel some pain, if you will, because that's what we learn from. And I wasn't very good at that early on. And part of it would be, as I mentioned, I would make them save some, and I would pay them interest. I'd pay them a high rate of interest, probably 10%. I wouldn't just stick them with a 1% savings account. I mean, I may have it in a savings account, but I would add to it. And the idea there would be to show them over time how much savings can grow. So to me, it's pretty simple. You're teaching them the importance of saving. You're teaching them the importance of giving. You're teaching them the value of compounding. You're also, if they spend what's left, they don't have to, they could save it, but if they spend what's left and they then are out of money, you've got to let them suffer the consequences for that. And I just didn't do a good job on all of that. I think I failed on all fronts. But it's hard, as a parent, it's hard to see your child, and I say suffer. I mean, in the world we live in, calling that suffering is probably a little bit over dramatic, but to them it's suffering, right? And that's what I would probably do. I think that would have gone a long way. So now, it's much easier to deal with a 5-year-old that's suffering because he or she can't buy a toy because they're out of money than it is a 25-year-old who doesn't have rent money. Are you going to make them suffer? You might. Maybe you should. I don't know. But there's a lot more at stake. So I wish I would have done a better job. Actually, in some ways, our kids are good with money, and in some ways, they're not. They both have their different strengths and weaknesses. But I was not intentional, I guess is the word, about that, and consistent. And I wish I would have been. So, Denise, that's what I would do. And there you go. I also think kids should be working. Our daughter worked in high school. Our son didn't. But they should be working, in my view. I don't know, I quite get that. Like a couple of things I've noticed about teenagers. So I'll show my age here. First of all, when I turned so in Ohio, you could not get your permit until you turn 16, but you could take the coursework to get your license. And then you turn 16, you get your driver's permit, and you can do the driving portion of the class, and then you can get your license. So I was ready to go. I had taken all the coursework. I hit 16. On my 16th birthday, my mom drove me to take the test. I got my driver's permit. I drove us home. I did the driving portion of the class, and 16 days later, I had my license. Kids today don't do that. I mean, we know plenty of kids that are 18, they don't have a driver's license. Like, what in the world is going on? And the mom and dad are just chauffeuring them around. It's like, are you kidding me? Anyway, that's number one. And they don't work. They don't have jobs in high school. It's like, well, we're too busy with this after-school thing and that after-school thing. That's great. I got my son ran track. They were both very involved in church. Get it, got it. That's important. But get a job. Anyway, that's just me. See, I'm showing my age. Just out of touch. Okay, well, that's what I got for you today. I know I didn't answer every question, but I'm kind of tired right now, and that's really what I got. So if I missed your question, hopefully I'll hit it in a future podcast, a future episode. Don't forget, this will, if you're listening to this, via iTunes or whatever, you can go to YouTube and get a nice view of my beer can collection behind me, and you can watch it there if you'd like. Hey, until next time, remember, the best thing money can buy is financial freedom.